Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is the final episode in a 4-part series on how to engage another person's story. In part 3, we looked at the first 5 tactics of story engagement. Today, we will complete the series by looking at the final 7 tactics to keep in mind when you are engaging someone's story. These are very specific things that you need to do as you are engaging with somebody who has just shared a story. Now, before teaching these final 6 tactics, I'd like to invite you to please consider supporting the podcast financially if it has been helpful to you. The way you can do that is go to my website and click on Support the Podcast, and there are a couple of options for making a donation. Thank you for considering it. Also, this is the final episode of Season 6. I do 20 episodes each season, and this is the final episode of Season 6. So as usual, I will take a couple of months off in between seasons so that I can create new content. Okay, tactic 6 of engaging another person's story is this. You want to continually bring your dialogue with the storyteller back to the story they have shared. As the two of you begin talking, there will be pressure to move away from the story that they have shared. Your task, in part, is to bring the dialogue back to the story. Back to the details of the story. You want to stay with the story. When you feel lost in a particular story engagement, it's not going well and you just kind of feel lost. You don't know where you are. Here is a surefire way to get back on track. Return to a specific moment in the story. That'll get you back on track almost every time very quickly. The storyteller is going to try various things to distract you from the story they have just told, okay? All right, they will start talking about how hard their marriage is, or what a terrible mother they are, or how they feel abandoned by God, or, anything and everything to distract you from engaging with the boy or girl in the story they have just shared. And your task is to continually bring them back to that boy or girl in the story. Now, how do you do this? Well, one way is you can simply say, look, I am happy to talk with you about your troubled marriage, but do you really want to leave that 16-year-old girl sitting at her birthday dinner table wondering if dad is going to get drunk or not? Do you want to leave her? You're giving the storyteller a choice. You're not demanding that they return to the story. You're inviting them to. And the implication, of course, is that you are attuned and attentive to that 16-year-old that she has just told you about. Here's another potential response. You can say, I'm more than willing to talk about your failures as a parent, but I'm also aware that you just shared a story about a 7-year-old boy who was required to soothe his mother because your dad was having an affair. What would it feel like to go back to the 7-year-old boy on the couch trying to comfort his sobbing mother? Again, it's not a demand. It's an invitation. So, tactic 6, you want to continually bring your dialogue with the storyteller back to the story that they have just shared. Okay, tactic 7. Identify the storyteller's feeling of complicity in their abuse. Identify their sense of complicity in their abuse. Okay, what is complicity? Complicity is the awareness that I voluntarily, at some level, I voluntarily participated in my abuse. For example, I was triangulated by my mother. This is my story. Okay, I was her functional husband. But no one held a gun to my head and forced me to walk across the house and give my mother a hug and talk with her about her sorrow every time I sensed her deep need for me. Nobody forced me to do that. I did that over and over on my own volition. Shame gets a foothold in our heart through complicity. Complicity is that felt sense that I voluntarily walked across the house and tended to my mother. The byproduct of complicity is that you will feel immense shame. Suppose a woman tells you a story about how she was sexually abused by her uncle 3 summers in a row as a middle schooler. And as she is talking with you, she contemptuously says this: after that first summer, I still asked my parents if I could go to my uncle's the next summer. What was I thinking? Do you see how she is using her feeling of complicity to convince you that she's a bad girl for asking to go to her uncle's again? The storyteller in this example wants you to join her in her self-contemptuous judgment that she must have wanted to be sexually abused, or that there was something wrong with her that she asked to go back to her uncle's house that next summer. Now, when she says this, what are you going to do? She has just put you in a bind. She has given you data that she wanted the sexual abuse from her uncle. Now, every fiber of your being is going to want to say, oh, no, you didn't want the sexual abuse. No middle school girl wants to be sexually abused. That's the kind of stuff that you're going to want to say to her. And if that is how you engage with her, then her self-contempt will likely win the day. Why? Because she knows that she asked her parents if she could go to her uncle's the next summer and the summer after that. She knows that she asked her parents. So how are you supposed to engage the reality of her complicity in her sexual abuse? The reality that the storyteller knows that they participated in their own abuse. How are you going to engage that? You have to do a sort of judo with them and put them in a bind. For example, of course you asked to go to your uncle's house again. He actually provided more care and attunement and kindness than either your mother or your father. You felt more special and more chosen at your uncle's house than at your own house, didn't you? Now, the storyteller knows that her desire for care and connection and attunement is why she wanted to go back to her uncle's the next summer. She is ashamed of her desire for care and connection, for being chosen, for being attended to, attuned to. She's ashamed of those desires. You have to slowly build a case so that she can acknowledge why she feels so much shame. Because this woman would rather say, I wanted it. I wanted the abuse. I'm dirty. She'd rather say that than she would engage the far more complex reality of, no, I didn't want to be abused, but hell yes, I wanted my uncle's care and attention. How do you address the shame someone feels because they know they were complicit in their abuse? How do you do that? In a word, blessing. The shame of complicity is overcome by blessing. Blessing what? Blessing this middle school girl's desire for care and connection and kindness. Blessing simply means naming something as good. So what if you said to the storyteller, can you bless how deeply that 7th grade girl wanted to be seen and noticed and cared about? Can you call those desires good? This is how you address the shame that she feels because she asked to go back to her uncle's the next summer. You have to bless the desire in her to be seen, cared for, paid attention to, all the stuff that her uncle did, which groomed her for the sexual abuse. That's how you address the shame of complicity. Okay, tactic 8 is very related to tactic 7, and this is going to sound both odd and wrong, okay? You have to amplify the storyteller's shame. Amplify the storyteller's shame. Yes, you heard that right. Whenever the storyteller gets close to shame, you are going to feel, as the listener, you're going to feel pulled to rescue them from that shame, to make it less, to make it go away. You actually need to do the opposite. You need to move closer to their shame and to amplify it. So, for example, consider the woman we were just talking about. Suppose she says to you, I should have known better than to go back there the next 2 summers, than to go back to my uncle's. I should have known better. Now, the temptation as the listener is to respond to her by saying something like, I don't think you should have known better. You were just a kid. This response is an attempt to convince her that she wasn't complicit. But look, she knows in her heart of hearts that she was complicit, and she was. No one forced her to go back to her uncle's. She asked to go there. She knows that. Her body knows that. If you try to argue her on that point, because you can't bear the shame that she is feeling, you are not going to be of help to her. So, how do you amplify her shame? By agreeing with her. You're right. You did ask to go to your uncle's house. You sure did. Even though you knew it was likely that he would abuse you again. And then you did it again the summer after that. Why would you do that? And then just sit in the silence. She is not going to know what to do with you because you, in your tone, in your posture, in your presence, you are not condemning that middle school girl, but you are also agreeing that she was complicit in her sexual abuse. This, by the way, is why it's so necessary to explore the trauma before the trauma first. If you haven't already established that this girl's mother and father provided little to no attunement, responsiveness, care, then you're going to get in trouble right here because you need to know the answer to your own question of why would you ask to go back to your uncle's house. You need to know the answer to that. You need to know that her uncle was the closest thing to the goodness of God that this 7th grader knew. You need to know that her parents were not providing adequate attunement, responsiveness, care for her, and that she had a deep, desperate hunger for those things because that's how God makes us. But in order to get to the place where you know that the closest thing to the goodness of God that this little girl knew was her uncle. In order to get to there, you have to be willing to amplify her shame rather than try to make her shame go away. And when you amplify shame and she sees it, there will be immense relief and immense grief and little to no self-contempt. And it is a holy moment that is the fruit of amplifying the storyteller's shame, moving closer to it. Okay, tactic 9. You need to notice when the storyteller turns on themselves and name it. It will be very helpful to develop a sort of 6th sense for self-contempt. Very helpful. When you notice, when you have a sense in your body that the storyteller has turned on herself or himself, you need to name their self-contempt. The closer that the storyteller gets to the shame of the boy or girl in the story, the more contempt they are likely to feel for themselves. Okay, so suppose a man shares a story about a time when his father yelled at him from the sidelines of a football game. He was a junior in high school. And you ask him, what was it like for you out on that field when your father is screaming at you? And the storyteller responds with, I felt humiliated. I always let him get to me, get under my skin. Even as a junior in high school, he was still getting under my skin. Do you hear the self-contempt in his response? I always let him get to me, even as a junior in high school. This man has turned on himself. He has contempt for the junior in high school. Anytime the storyteller turns on themselves, you need to pause whatever you are doing, wherever you are going, whatever brilliant point you're about to make. You need to pause and engage their self-contempt. How? It's as simple as, did you feel that shift inside just now? When you said to me, I always let my dad get to me, it was like you were picking up a dagger and stabbing yourself for being weak, for being sensitive. Did you feel that? You're inviting this man to own his self-contempt, to own how he has turned on himself, to own his self-violence. Now, if he has the integrity to acknowledge that, yes, he did pick up a dagger and turn on himself for being so affected by his father, then you're at a fork in the road. Okay? If he has the integrity to own the self-contempt, now you're at a fork in the road, because you can't join him in his self-violence. You can't join him in his self-contempt. So you need to say, I can't join you in turning against that junior in high school. But can we go back in the story to where you were right before the self-contempt kicked in? Can we go back to right there? Self-contempt is an exit from unbearable feelings. You have to honor the fact that this storyteller left the emotional place he was in because it felt too vulnerable. It felt unbearable. That's why he turned on himself. So the question is, for him, would you like to be finished for now? Or would you like to go back to where you were right before you picked up that dagger and turned on yourself for being so affected by your father screaming at you? You're giving him a choice about how he would like to proceed. And it's up to him. It's his story. So tactic 9 is identify self-contempt when it arises. Okay, tactic 10. You want to invite the storyteller in your presence to feel their grief. Wherever they are with regard to the story at hand, you want to invite them to take another step closer to grief. Remember, we said it at the beginning of this whole series, back in the first part of this series, we said that one of the goals of story engagement is grieving together. Grief feels like death. And that's because when you are grieving something, you are letting in the reality of the death of something. For the storyteller to actually feel the weight of the fact that they were never mothered will feel like a death. And that's because it is a death. 5 minutes ago, they had a mother, at least in their mind. You have just shown that they actually don't have a mother, that they were and are a functional orphan. Once that has been named, you've got to let the storyteller feel the weight of the grief of losing their mother. The weight of the grief of a more accurate understanding of their story, both past and present. The weight of the grief of, I thought my mother cared about me some, but I've just been confronted with data that I've shared that shows she actually was never a mother to me. Kathy Lorzell, my friend, is fond of saying that there is no resurrection without death. And that is a very good sentence, a very important sentence. Do you believe that? The Christian narrative is that resurrection and healing cannot exist for a person until the person has experienced the death of something. Jesus didn't ascend into glory after the Last Supper. Okay, he first had to go through immense suffering and the experience of death. It is no different for his followers. If you read the Gospel of Mark 3 times, he tells his disciples, it will be no different for you. And it's no different for us. We have to go through our deaths in order for resurrection and healing to begin to exist for us. So your task is to invite the storyteller to sit with the heartache and death in their story. Your task is to bear witness to their suffering as they feel the immensity of their death, and really of their deaths, plural. To linger in death, which is what you're inviting them to do, is not merely cognitively reflecting on a traumatic experience. It is that, but it also requires entering the scene limbically. That is, with your limbic brain, your emotions and your bodily sensations, and then staying there for a little while. To linger in death means to sit in the particular moments of betrayal in your life, of powerlessness, of shame that mark your stories. This is what it means to enter death, and death evokes grief. All too often, we shy away from inviting the storyteller to feel their grief in our presence because we are uncomfortable with the storyteller's big emotions. This happens all the time. Many potentially transformative moments, many potentially healing moments are missed because of our discomfort with the feelings that surface as someone comes close to pain that their body has held for years, but that has not been fully felt and has not been metabolized. It has not been experienced. It has not been expressed. So, tactic 10 is invite them to feel their grief. Okay, tactic 11. You want to use data points from their story and from what they share with you to build a case. All right, bear with me. When you are engaging someone's story, you need to view yourself. Dan Allender was the one who first said this to me, and I've found it so helpful. You need to view yourself as a defense attorney for the boy or girl in the story. What does a good defense attorney do? They slowly build a case to support their claim that the boy or girl is innocent, at least innocent of the charges that the storyteller, as an adult, currently holds them in contempt for. Okay, your task is to be a defense attorney for the boy or girl that they have just shared about in this story. And in order to be a defense attorney, you have to pay very close attention to data that they share with you and build a case for the innocence of this child. Now, when you establish, for example, that the storyteller was triangulated as a girl, and if the storyteller agrees with you about that claim, i.e. you get buy-in from the storyteller, you both agree, yes, I was triangulated as a girl, you have just submitted Exhibit A to the court. When you establish that the storyteller's mother was rarely, if ever, attuned and responsive, you have just established a piece of data. Okay, Exhibit B. Each piece of data is like a concrete block, and you are going to lay down concrete block after concrete block until you have built a solid foundation. The foundation has to be strong enough and solid enough so that when you invite the storyteller to bless the boy or girl in the story, they have so much data staring them in the face that they have no intellectual reason not to bless that boy or girl. Does that make sense? The concrete blocks, the pieces of data, they need to be laid down so that when the storyteller is looking at the data, they have no intellectual reason not to bless the boy or girl in the story. It is very important to make sure that the storyteller agrees with you about each piece of data that you are laying down. All right, you have to get buy-in. If they disagree with you, for example, that they were triangulated, that is not a concrete block. You might think they were triangulated, but if they don't, that's not a concrete block. You have to get their buy-in before you can proceed in laying down that concrete block of data. So for example, I will say something like to a client, to a storyteller, I'll say something like, so you're aware that your mother had an icy cruelty towards you growing up? And they will nod. My next sentence is always, does your nod mean yes, you hear me, or yes, you agree with me? I'm getting buy-in. I'm not going to proceed until the storyteller gives a hearty yes to the claim that her mother was immensely cruel toward her. So, tactic 11, in summary, like a good defense attorney, use data points from their story to slowly build a case about the truthfulness, the innocence of the boy or girl in the story. Now, relatedly, tactic 12, you want to explore the storyteller's posture toward that boy or girl in the story. Oh, this is so important. The person you are engaging with has just told you a story about themselves as a younger person. Perhaps it's a 7-year-old boy or a 14-year-old girl. It's important to understand the storyteller, as an adult, has a relationship with that 7-year-old boy. The woman you are presently sitting with has a relationship with herself as a 14-year-old girl. Most likely, that relationship is not very kind. The storyteller may likely have joined in cursing the 7-year-old boy. They may have made agreements with evil about the heart of the 14-year-old girl. So good story engagement will eventually involve an exploration of the storyteller's posture in the present toward the boy or girl in the story. Let me give an example. A man has just shared a story about himself as an 8th grader. Throughout his 8th grade year, he was sexually abused by his band instructor. And during the story engagement, the man says to you, he says, I can see myself voluntarily riding my bike over to my band instructor's house, even though I knew he was going to abuse me again. This might be a good time to ask, what is your posture toward the boy riding his bike over to your band instructor's house? Or another way of saying that is, how do you feel right now toward the boy riding his bike over to the band teacher's house? Now, of course, you know the answer, but you want him to own that he is filled with contempt for that 8th grader on his bike. Why do you want him to own that? Because this man cannot soften toward that boy, toward that 8th grader, until he is aware of how much he hates him. Once you've identified that his posture toward the boy in the story is contemptuous, is violent, is condemning, the next step is to invite him to ponder the possibility of blessing that 8th grade boy on his bike. And this is going to piss him off. Your kindness toward that boy is going to anger him. Why? Why? Because the last person who was this kind to him was his band instructor. And so your kindness is going to feel identical to the way he was groomed by his abuser. You have to do it anyway. And then you have to name that your kindness feels to him like you are setting him up for abuse. Do you see, oh my gosh, do you see why engaging stories of abuse is so fraught? Of course it's fraught. Sometimes you have to move back and forth between how the storyteller feels about you in the present and how that is similar to how the storyteller felt about his abuser in the past. And those can be very therapeutic, healing, holy conversations when you help the storyteller make that linkage, because it is a visceral, felt sense in their body of how they are experiencing you, and how they are experiencing you very similarly to what it was like to feel the kindness of their band instructor. And eventually, once you talk through some of this stuff, you can return to inviting him to bless that 8th grader on his bike. Now for what? Bless him for what? For his deep longing to be seen and noticed and chosen. Again, this is why it's necessary to first identify the trauma before the trauma. If the storyteller has not agreed with you that he grew up in an emotionally impoverished home with little to no attunement or pursuit from his parents, then he won't have any compassion on his desperate soul hunger, which set him up to be seduced by his band instructor. If the storyteller has integrity, and if you have gotten his buy-in along the way, his buy-in about each piece of data, then he will know that 8th grader on his bike actually deserves blessing. That he actually deserves to be called good as he's riding his bike over there. That it makes sense. Because God made us to be chosen, to be delighted in, to be cared for. Now, the question is, at this point in the engagement, how would you like to live your life? That's your question for this man. Your narrative finally makes sense to you. Would you like to bless that 8th grader for riding his bike over to his band teacher's house, or would you like to continue to make that 8th grader pay? Each of us has younger versions of ourselves. There are only 2 possible postures toward the younger yous: a posture of cursing or a posture of blessing. If you cannot give a wholehearted blessing to yourself as a junior in high school, to yourself as a middle schooler, to yourself as a 3rd grader, if you can't bless each of those kids, then you are at some level cursing them. There is no middle ground. So, final tactic for today is to explore the storyteller's posture toward the boy or girl in the story. Okay, that was a whirlwind. There it is. Those are the final 7 tactics you can use when engaging another person's story. Remember to please consider supporting the podcast financially if it's been helpful to you. Just go to my website, click on support the podcast, and there are a couple of options for making a donation. You have just finished listening to the final episode of season 6. I am going to take a couple of months off to create new content, and then season 7 will begin in October. Thank you so much. I mean, truly, thank you so much for listening to this podcast.